Welcome, everyone. This is a webinar from the Quincy Institute, the aftermath of South Korea's martial law fiasco. I'm happy you can join us. My name is Jake Warner. I lead the East Asia work at the Quincy Institute. We're a transpartisan think tank that promotes ideas moving U.S. foreign policy and national security away from global domination and militarism and toward a new strategy of diplomatic engagement and peaceful great power relations. South Korea is actually at the center of these efforts because of its extremely important strategic position. First, tensions on the peninsula itself between North Korea and South Korea have been intensifying in dangerous ways in recent years. So we could see conflict begin on the peninsula that would pull in the great powers. Second, because the United States has been trying in recent years to organize its regional alliance network into a geopolitical bloc that could confront China. As a result, when Yoon, the current president, at least for the time being, of South Korea, was elected 2 years ago, the DC foreign policy establishment rejoiced because they knew that a right-wing leader in power would welcome anti-China moves in a way that the progressives would not. But finally, also South Korea is important because it could be the source of a different direction in the region, in U.S. alliances, in U.S. relations with China, and of course, in the relationship between South Korea and North Korea. So today we're going to talk about all of these issues. We're going to try to give you a very solid grounding in the recent turmoil within South Korean politics, and then try to draw some bigger conclusions about what that means in U.S. foreign policy, in regional geopolitics, and in the future of South Korean politics as well. So I'm very happy to have joining me three distinguished guests to discuss these issues. First, Nathan Park is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and an attorney based in DC. His practice focuses on international litigation, arbitration, and regulatory actions, including trade and export control. He writes frequently on politics and economy of East Asia in major publications like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, CNN, and Foreign Policy. Let me recommend Nathan's recent immediate sort of post self-coup analysis that appeared in Foreign Policy. I thought it gave an excellent overview of the events themselves and stands up a couple of weeks later for charting out the likely direction of things that we will be discussing further in this webinar. Second, we're also joined by Natalia Slavny. She is a research analyst for the Korea program at the Stimson Center, as well as an assistant editor for 38 North at Stimson. Her research experience and interests include humanitarianism and aid, international law, human rights, inter-Korean relations, U.S.-North Korea relations, and digital surveillance and information controls in North Korea, as well as the North Korean economy. Thank you for joining us, Natalia. And finally, we have James Park. He's a research associate at the Quincy Institute's East Asia program. His research covers South Korean foreign policy and domestic politics, Chinese security issues, and U.S. policy in East Asia. He has written about Korean and Chinese affairs for a number of different outlets, including the Diplomat, National Interest, and Quincy's own publication, Responsible Statecraft. So I'm very glad all three of you can join me today. We're going to jump right into some discussion here. I'll raise some questions. I welcome everyone in the audience to please submit your own questions. We'll keep 20 minutes or so at the end of the hour to discuss audience questions. So if at any point you have a question that jumps to mind, just enter that into the chat and we'll get to it. So I'd like to begin just by trying to give everyone an overview of what actually has happened in the last less than 3 weeks. So quite a bit has elapsed in South Korea. Nathan, I wonder if you could kind of begin that process, just give us a sense of the events of December 3, the fallout from that, and where things stand today.
Sure, yeah. There's a saying that says there are months where months that pass by a week and weeks where months happen, and these 3 weeks have been the weeks that where months and beyond happened. So let's do a quick run through of what happened since December 3rd. Late night December 3rd, past 10 p.m., President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law, and this was an incredibly significant event. First emergency martial law declaration in 44 years, 45 years. Um, and it is that the word martial law immediately invokes among the minds of South Koreans of military dictatorship, tanks in the streets, and civilian massacres. And this is a direct historical memory coming out of the massacre resulting from the Gwangju Uprising in 1980 at the hands of the military junta led by dictator Chun Doo-hwan. So it was received with a great deal of shock. Fortunately, it ended quickly because the National Assembly, the South Korea's legislature, acted very quickly. It is mostly led by the opposition party, the Democratic Party of Korea, and they, the lawmakers and public protesters, secured the passage, literally climbed over walls and barricades of the National Assembly Hall to convene together at the main assembly hall to vote to lift the martial law as special forces were breaking windows and streaming into the hall. It was quite an image that soldiers with guns were coming down the legislative hall, and the legislators were still trying to do their level best to keep proper procedure to vote to lift the martial law. So in all, the martial law attempt, Yoon's self-coup attempt, lasted about 6 hours. The president himself claimed that the martial law was necessary because of sharp elbow tactics by the legislature dominated by liberals. Later in the past 2.5 weeks or so, a lot of details have come out as a result of investigations, and the plan that Yoon had set up is quite shocking. We are just very fortunate that this event ended in a matter of hours because it was executed poorly in the early stages. But the plan itself included arresting legislators, holding them in black site bunkers so that they cannot vote to lift the martial law. It involved seizing National Election Commission, to discredit election results and claim false election fraud claims, to discredit the election that led to a Democratic majority National Assembly. It even involved false flag operations. It had special forces, South Korean special forces, dressed as North Korean commandos, and attempting to either kidnap or kill significant South Korean political leaders and make it seem like it was North Korea's doing. So these are the details that are unfolding right now. And just to conclude in terms of where we are headed next, on the 14th, the National Assembly voted to impeach President Yoon. So he's no longer the president. His presidential duty is currently suspended. And right now, the acting president is the Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. While Yoon is being suspended, the matter now goes to the Constitutional Court, where the impeachment trial will be held. And the Constitutional Court has 180 days to decide whether the impeachment will be sustained or rejected. If sustained, Yoon is removed from office. Rejected, Yoon can come back to office. 180 days is the statutory deadline, but South Korea has had two experiences with presidential impeachment, and generally those trials ended significantly earlier. The impeachment trial of the former President Park Geun-hye that took place in 2017 ended in about 90 days. So that's where things stand right now.
All right, and just to clarify, if the impeachment is sustained by the Constitutional Court, Yoon would step down immediately, and then a new presidential election would follow. Is that right?
That's correct. Yoon will step down immediately, and there is a snap election that will take place in 60 days.
Is there any sense of how likely? My understanding is the Constitutional Court has the balance of power on the court is conservative in nature. Is there any sense of how likely it is that they will uphold the impeachment?
So that is the $1 million question at this moment. And so let me go into a little bit of a constitutional court lawfare, as it were. So constitutional court in Korea is it's called a court, but it's not a part of the judiciary. It's a special body, so it's not like the U.S. Supreme Court. What it's supposed to do, constitutional court, is a court that sits outside and on top of the three branches of the government, the executive, legislature, and the judiciary. Constitutional court has three justices appointed by each branch of the government to form a 9-member bench. So here's the tricky part. Right now, the Constitutional Court is shorthanded. There are supposed to be 9 justices. There are only 6 because the National Assembly's selections, the 3 justices that the National Assembly are supposed to appoint, are going through the appointment process right now. This makes things tricky because in order to sustain an impeachment, 6 out of 9 justices must vote in favor. And the quorum for hearing the case is 7. So if and here's the tricky part. The South Korean Constitution says that at the end of the day, even though the 3 branches of the government not select and nominate these justice candidates, it is the president who appoints them. Right now, the president is suspended, and there's the acting president, Han Duck-soo, who has served under the Yoon government. And there is some debate as to whether or not he can appoint the justices, whether or not he has a discretion to not appoint them. And this part is uncharted territory, and it'll be a very significant issue going forward.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and it is very tricky. And I then would expect a significant potential role for street protests yet again. The South Korean people have shown that they are willing and able to force their political elite in a particular direction through protests. So that's something to track closely. I'd like to turn to Natalia and ask for a little bit of the context, sort of what are the forces that brought us to this impasse where Yoon decided that the only way he could move forward was to pursue this extraordinary and extremely dangerous measure. What's kind of going on in the background here? How is it that partisan politics in South Korea became so polarized, and what exactly are the disputes that are dividing the Democratic Party from Yoon?
Yeah, so this seems to have been a result of years of buildup of frustrations from both the ruling party and the main opposition party toward Yoon and his administration. Yoon, when he was running in 2022, ran a very contentious campaign. He's had pretty low approval ratings throughout his tenure, thanks to being associated with different kinds of scandals, including alleged bribery, stock manipulation, overall abuses of power, and his wife is also implicated in some of these allegations. And it follows a worrying trend of abuse of powers, especially with the rise of anti-defamation cases that we've seen in the last few years and impingements on freedom of speech. So calls of impeachment had already begun way before this had been happening. There were some calls for impeachment back in August when Yoon was introducing cabinet nominations of more hawkish individuals and those with whom he had personal connections, such as the former defense minister Kim Yong-hyun, who was reportedly one of the people to convince Yoon to declare martial law in the first place. They've known each other since their school days, and when he was nominated back in August, there were some rumblings from the opposition party about how his appointments were following a trend of setting the stage for declaring something like martial law. So this has been a long time coming. But back in April, the ruling party hit a big snag when they lost majority of their seats in parliament, effectively hampering a lot of Yoon's policies and plans that have to be passed through the National Assembly. So one of them included a major budget bill that had been rejected the night before martial law had been imposed, which was cited as one of his reasons. So definitely a lot of buildup of frustrations domestically. Yoon inherited a difficult economy from the Moon Jae-in administration, but he also ran on a campaign of trying to stop fake news and have more transparency and work for the people. But I don't think the South Korean people are feeling those efforts. There's nationwide strikes among medical workers that have been affecting everybody throughout the country. There's rising housing prices and inflation issues, and some regional and geopolitical uncertainty that they have to reckon with. So this just seems to be a buildup of frustrations domestically.
Thank you. James, I want to ask you about kind of the foreign policy background to these tensions between the two sides. What are sort of the key characteristics of Yoon's foreign policy, and to what extent has foreign policy with the US, with Japan, with China, with North Korea, to what extent have ties with these other countries played into the partisan tensions that led to the blow up?
Yeah, I would say, in my view, the most notable sort of foreign policy differences between Yoon and the Liberal Minju Party have been on North Korea and Japan. So, Yoon has taken a very sort of adversarial, confrontational position on North Korea. I would say even further toward the extreme end than his conservative predecessors, who were fairly tough on North Korea. On the other hand, the liberals prefer to sort of build a peaceful relationship through inter-Korean engagement, diplomacy, and cooperation. And as a result, obviously, tensions have been building up between Yoon and the liberals. And the liberals have been, critical of Yoon for pursuing an overly aggressive policy and increasing tensions with North Korea on the one hand. On the other hand, Yoon has done his part to provoke the opposition liberals by working to reverse the previous liberal President Moon Jae-in's legacy on North Korea, such as by moving away from the 2018 Inter-Korean Military Pact, in which the two Koreas agreed to limit border area military activities and provocations. And as we've seen in Yoon's martial law speech and many other statements by him since his inauguration, Yoon has accused the opposition party and its supporters of being, anti-state forces under the influence of North Korean subversion. In this dynamic, partisan tensions were, just about to, it was just going to ramp up as time goes by over North Korea. And the liberals have also been deeply frustrated by how Yoon has unilaterally moved forward to accommodate Japan on wartime history issues in order to improve political and military ties with Japan. But Yoon's reconciliation project with Japan, it has sort of neglected the necessary domestic consensus building. And under this dynamic, the tensions have also, gone up. Earlier this year, in one press statement, the Conservative Party, ruling party spokesman accidentally referred to the US-ROK Japan Trilateral Security Partnership as a trilateral military alliance. And this incident led to huge confrontation between the conservatives and the liberals at the National Assembly, one hearing, with the liberals kind of screaming, yelling how South Korea could just forget history and the territorial dispute over Dokdo Takeshima and just form a military alliance with Japan. So, I don't think foreign policy has played a decisive role in this political sort of conflict up to date. But much of the conflict has been over domestic issues, as Nathan and Natalia have explained. But I have to say, the kind of sharp partisan foreign policy differences, of course, I would say must have had some effect in the overall sort of formulation of a tense, divisive domestic environment. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is certainly reflected in the rhetoric that Yoon used in the martial law declaration, which was really a throwback to kind of Cold War era, branding progressive forces as aligned with the communists and sort of proxy agents of the communists. So yes, thank you, James. Nathan, I want to come back to you, and I do want to return to the foreign policy implications and talk about that for a bit. But before we do that, Nathan, could you talk a little bit about kind of what the political landscape in South Korea is likely to look like on the other side of this? So you already explained that it's uncertain if Yoon will even be removed, despite even much of the conservative parties having turned against him and being extraordinarily unpopular, even before the martial law incident. And now his approval ratings are just rock bottom. But Yoon won election. The election that brought Yoon to power was so close. He just barely won it. Sort of reflects a deep polarization in South Korean politics. Is all of this likely to break that open and we have a new era of kind of progressive dominance, or is that kind of very 50-50 split in the politics likely to persist?
Right. So let's walk through this a little bit. Let's walk through a couple scenarios because the situation is very uncertain. So I'm gonna make some key assumptions, and I will. These are by no means set in stone, not at all. But let's assume that the Constitutional Court will be fully benched with 9 justices, and they will vote to remove Yoon. At least when it comes to the actual impeachment trial, virtually all respected constitutional scholars, including former constitutional justices within South Korea, are virtually unanimous that this is impeachment worthy. This current constitution of South Korea that was set in 1987 is designed to precisely prevent this type of self-coup from taking place. So a direct frontal challenge to that is not likely to survive. And here's one side point that I want to make. I think it's a little bit of a detour, but I think it's important. There is some tendency, it's fine to be studying the structural issues and what the events that took place that led to this moment, but we should not lose sight of the fact how extraordinary this is. It's not an extension of regular politics. There is deep partisanship between the two major parties. There's a lot of sharp elbows thrown in terms of parliamentary procedures and legal cases and what have you, but those all operated within the legal system and a democratic system of South Korea. And in attempting a martial law like this is not an act of governance. Let's put it that way. It's not an extension of normal politics. It's an attempt to overthrow the system altogether. So that's a very important point that needs to be that everybody needs to remember. So coming back to your point, Jake, what is likely to take place? Yoon's election he won his election in 22 by a margin of 0.7%. And it was a little bit of an upset because his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, a liberal president, was very popular as he was leaving. And this very close election took place, much of it because the rising cost of housing and the popular anger that the frustration and anger that was felt by especially people in Seoul who are usually Democratic voters. Um, those voters switched over to conservative side, and that's what allowed Yoon to squeak past that election. And there's some parallels to the U.S. election that just took place as well. Yoon was never very popular to begin with, but this economic grievance, this economic resentment led to this very narrow victory. Since then, in the 2.5 years, South Korean economy has not improved. It has been suffering. It has been suffering pretty significantly. And so right now, when you see the polls, you see the liberal candidates all but running away in a potential next election. What will happen next is that the South Korean conservatives right now, they suffered a massive loss in the legislative election that took place in April of this year. And whatever next presidential election that comes, again, making some key assumptions that it will come, is going to look a lot like that. And I'm expecting that at least in the near term, South Korean conservatives will be facing a relatively bleak pasture where they are confined to far-right extremists and certain regional bases that have been a bulwark for their support.
Thanks, Nathan. Natalia, I want to come back to you and let's come back to the issue of foreign policy and how all of this connects with international relations in the region. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what Yoon was aiming at in his foreign policy. I mean, I think most Americans, if they are aware of his presidency, they will know that he came to the White House and he sang American Pie for Joe Biden, and that's maybe it. I want to try to get a sense of the substance. What was he really aiming for before he got himself impeached? And what are the tensions between what he was going for and his actual record of governance in South Korea?
Well, I think James laid it out pretty plainly previously that Yoon was trying to make a name for himself after the Moon Jae-in government and was going in a different direction in terms of foreign policy, especially as it related to North Korea, less engagement, more hawkish. And then in terms of relations with the United States, I think that most South Korean presidents want to keep the US-ROK alliance and general bilateral cooperation going strong. There's a lot of economic cooperation to be gained, and Yoon made strong moves to place South Korea as a global pivotal state with a large stake in the global economy and playing big power politics. So despite wanting to move away from Moon Jae-in administration policies, I think that has stayed the course and will likely continue to stay the course no matter who takes over as president. So I think that Yoon wanted to come out strong with his policies and to show other powers in the region that South Korea should be paid attention to, that they're also part of these great power competitions and they have a role to play. They're very strong in the economy and they're not someone to just brush off, especially with how the US is working against China. And I think South Korea wanted to jump in on that. But it's interesting to see the tension between foreign policy goals and how it comes across domestically as well. I think you see the same issue in the United States where a lot of South Koreans feel like they're suffering at home. Why aren't they reaping any of the benefits personally? And why are some of these domestic issues taking so long to resolve? So I think even no matter what kind of policies he would have introduced, there would have been some tensions, but he really doubled down, especially in the last coming weeks, and he's still continuing to double down that he's done nothing wrong.
James, I want to ask about kind of the outcomes of this in bilateral relationships with South Korea. How has Yoon's foreign policy translated to relations with the North, what's the nature of the growing tensions there, and is there a prospect for a real change of course if progressives do return to the presidency? And maybe also if you can take into account the fact that we have a new president coming into office here in the United States and how that might play into all of this.
Right. I think there are a lot of different factors to consider when we sort of look at the implications with North Korea going forward. Clearly, the next liberal administration is gonna try to prioritize, sort of reviving dialogue, diplomacy, but then, dialogue is obviously two-way. It's not just one way. So, South Korea will get it only if North Korea wants it. And it's very uncertain at this point if North Korea has any strong interest in re-engagement with either the US or South Korea. So I guess it remains to be seen. But with the combination of liberal president in Seoul and the incoming US President Trump, who expressed his interest in renewing sort of engagement with Kim Jong-un and North Korea, maybe there is potential, but at the same time, we've seen sort of the undiplomatic side of Trump as well, with regard to North Korea. In 2017, we were in, I would say, pretty serious danger of war, with talks of, preventive war, coming from the White House and so on. So yeah, I think it's such a mixed bag. But North Korea is still, on its way to sort of finalize its 5-year military plan that it announced in I think 2021 or 2022. So we still got at least 1 or 2 more years, in terms of that timeline. I think it's gonna be eventually up to whether North Korea feels that it has gained enough leverage to come back to the negotiating table. But yeah.
Can you say a little more about what North Korea's reservations are? Did it feel really betrayed by the way that the last sort of era of negotiations with Trump and the Moon Jae-in government kind of blew up, or has Kim Jong-un really changed his perception on these things and thinks it's no longer possible to negotiate, or how do you read the indications there?
Well, many observers, I'm sure including you guys, like Kim Jong-un, there are good reasons to believe that he might have felt sort of backstabbed or sabotaged by the whole process. Back then President Moon was sort of, with his personal interactions with Kim Jong-un, engagement with Kim Jong-un, I think he perhaps has done his part to sort of hype it up, the hope. And in individual conversations between Kim Jong-un and Trump, I'm sure there were promising talks happening, and showing up to the negotiating table, realizing that things don't look like what he was picturing, Yeah. Certainly I'm sure, yeah. There was sort of misperception, sort of overblown hope in a way on all sides. Yeah, this time I'm sure Kim Jong-un's more pessimistic, and with the looking at what happened in Syria, and looking at all these talks coming from Washington about the need for nuclear expansion, if I was Kim Jong-un, yeah, I wouldn't be so sure why should I be abandoning these nuclear weapons that can only guarantee regime security at this point, So yeah, I think things are looking more bleak, but yeah.
Thank you. Nathan, could you reflect a little bit how you see the possibility? So the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party would be Lee Jae-myung. Are there any other figures out there that have a real shot at the presidency on the Democratic side? And then what kind of foreign policy aside from North Korea, which James already talked about, but the rest of the foreign policy issues that impinge on South Korea, what would you expect coming from a Democratic administration should they return to the presidency?
Right. So let's it's really two parts, right? One is who is likely to be the next president, and two, what is that president's foreign policy going to look like? So let's take each one in turn. Right now, the presumptive favorite is Lee Jae-myung. He ran against Yoon in 22 and lost very narrowly. Since then, he's been the party chairman, party president of the Democratic Party, and right now, in most opinion polls, he's running away as the most preferred candidate. If not Lee, the second most likely candidate is going to be Governor Kim Dong-yeon, who is a governor of Gyeonggi-do province. It's a very large and very populous province that surrounds Seoul. So it's the entire province is like a suburb of Seoul, essentially. And Lee Jae-myung himself was previously Gyeonggi-do province governor before going into this politics. So that goes to show the gravitas that office tends to offer for potential nominees. So those I would say those two are the two most likely, with Lee Jae-myung currently being the heavy favorite. In terms of how the foreign policy will look like, I might offer it was a couple years ago that for the Korean Economic Institute, I offered a series on an overview of how South Korean liberals conceive their foreign policy, and I think either Lee Jae-myung or Kim Dong-yeon, I don't think it'll deviate all that much from this playbook. And this playbook basically says this: South Korean liberals, they're in Washington, D.C., they are, I think, a bit unfairly maligned as pro-North Korea, pro-China, anti-US, and that I don't think is true. At least the anti-US accusations have faded significantly. But how they are different from South Korean conservatives is that they are more focused on practicality. They're more focused on the idea that South Korea needs to be master of its own destiny. It means that it will try to be friendly with everybody without necessarily making strong ideological commitment one way or the other. That does not mean any discounting of the US-Korea alliance, but it does mean that it does mean that someone like Lee Jae-myung or someone like Kim Dong-yeon is going to come to the White House and sing American Pie, which was seen among South Korean liberals certainly as groveling. So that will be a difference. A more pronounced difference is how I don't think the U.S.-South Korea relationship will be affected very much. On the other hand, the big challenge is whether or not the United States can continue maintaining this trilateral coordination between U.S. and South Korea and Japan. And here's a part where I think it's a real indictment on Washington, D.C., especially since Quincy Institute is committed to doing diplomacy differently from the status quo. The Yoon administration really really went along strongly with the Biden administration's push to build this trilateral partnership, and in doing so, made significant amount of concessions that were just taken as offensive by the South Korean public as to Japan. So these issues include issues of giving reparations for the Korean wartime slave laborers who were conscripted by Japanese corporations in the war effort. It also has to do with release of radioactive wastewater that were processed out of the Fukushima nuclear plant that melted down. And in each one of these issues, Yoon administration more or less gave all unilateral concessions that did not sit well with the South Korean public. And this was all going towards it was all adding up to Yoon being extremely unpopular, in addition to the suffering economy, in addition to the Yoon's burgeoning authoritarian tendencies. So here I think is a part where the United States and Washington, D.C. really made a blunder, where this trilateral alliance may or may not be a good idea. I think that part still needs to be debated. But even assuming it was a good idea, it could have been pursued more skillfully. It could have been pursued in a way that traveled with the South Korean public opinion and honestly help Yoon by leaning on Japan to make at least a little more concession towards achieving this goal. And there was no such effort. And it was just a really unsophisticated effort, I might dare say, where the Washington, D.C. would just tell the Yoon administration, this is what we're going to do, now march in this direction. They simply did it without trying to make the effort of trying to coordinate, okay, what can I do to make your life easier with the South Korean public to make this alliance work better for your presidency and your popularity.
Thanks. Natalia, I wanna sort of bring this question over to you. How do you see this all playing out in DC circles? And do you think that there is likely to be some critical self-reflection on the part of the foreign policy establishment in DC around missteps in building this sort of a relationship with Yoon? Or do you think that it's more likely to play out as just hostility towards the Liberal Party if they should come into the presidency?
Well, it's always fun to comment on what people call the DC Blob. I think there are a lot of criticisms that should be taken seriously. I do think that many people, when martial law was enacted, were concerned with the lack of strong condemnation from the U.S. government. I think in most of the DC policy circle, we were expecting a stronger reaction from people like Blinken, from Biden, rather than just saying that they were going to watch the situation closely. Because Yoon and the US have been promoting South Korea as a beacon of democracy, and it just was not being played out that way. And it did not make the DC policy community look like it knew what it was talking about. So I do think
Well,
this
and
is a good.
it's worth noting that South Korea was the setting for one of the premier Biden administration democracy events that they held was it last year? But
Yeah. So, and this is going also off of South Korea promoting itself as a major player in these democratic and multilateral institutions. It's planning on hosting APEC next year. So Yoon was really positioning himself in that power, but he was not in line with the democratic values that both he and the Biden administration were promoting that South Korea was going to be in line with. So I think the DC policy community does have an opportunity to be a little bit more critical without worrying necessarily about how those criticisms will be taken, because you should be able to make criticisms of your friends and allies without people taking it too personally and without that majorly affecting relationships. But we'll just have to see. I think this comes at a really interesting time with a lot of shifts in leadership, both in the US and South Korea and in the region. Nathan made a really good point about how trilateral relations could have been pursued more skillfully. And we were coming off of a leader, Kishida, who was not really wanting to be in power after Abe's assassination. And we're still wondering who's going to fill that gap in Japan. So there's just a lot of questions and a lot of moving parts. Sometimes it feels like it's kind of a clown car situation in South Korea, with so many people in the PPP resigning, also being implicated in indictments. Lee Jae-myung has his own indictments to deal with. And if he does not win his appeal, I think I've read that he will be banned from political office and running in any kind of elections for 10 years. So while Yoon's team is refusing to accept documents from the Constitutional Court's investigation, and he's being investigated by 3 different task force from the police, who else? The police, the commission of, I'm losing my mind. Commission. Anyway, three different offices, Nathan. Yeah.
Yeah, in the Corruption Investigation Office.
So he's just denying it, and there's a delay factor with the Constitutional Court as well. So there's just a lot of different timelines to keep track of.
yeah, all of that is really very interesting. I think there's this parallel that Nathan pointed out between South Korean the sort of structural parallel between South Korean politics and American politics. Of course, it may be next year that the Trump administration throws the entire country into chaos around investigating political enemies, or throws the alliance with both Japan and South Korea into chaos around tariff wars, or maybe not. There's just an extraordinary level of, and thanks for raising the instability in Japanese politics too, because there just is democratic politics in all 3 countries is deeply unsettled, and I think there are some very interesting parallels among them. James, I'm wondering what you think about the DC response here, and I am also wondering the thing that we haven't talked very much about that is close to my heart is China and how China fits into all of this. So if you have any thoughts on China, and I want to also invite the audience, if you have any questions. Well, there is one question in the chat thus far. If anyone else wants to add, we'll address those in a minute. James.
Yeah, what I want to point out is that we shouldn't be sort of regarding Yoon as a norm. I think he was an outlier, as to how far he was willing to align with the US, from the broader regional strategic perspective. Over the years, I think South Korean sort of grand strategic orientation, I would say I would characterize it as like more risk averse, a lot of risk aversion. And like public polls consistently show that, like they consistently reflect divisions and mixed feelings among South Koreans about China. Like a lot of South Koreans are wary of China, the existence of assertive great power on its doorstep, of course. And they share the necessity for security risk reduction facing China in that sense. And that sense of risk aversion, it would translate into support for the military alliance with the US and sort of avoiding economic over-reliance on China, particularly after the THAAD retaliation, even increasingly so. But at the same time, when you look at public polls, there's a lot of reluctance to the idea of decoupling with the Chinese market, which is, a significant source of South Korean trade income and supply chains, and also a lot of reluctance to the idea of sort of pursuing an adversarial, risking an adversarial military relationship with China. When you look at 2023 survey by East Asia Institute, it's a South Korean think tank. It shows that 80% of South Koreans view bilateral ties with China as important. And about half of South Koreans would prefer a cautious sort of neutral position in a severe US-China conflict. Let's say like a contingency over Taiwan. And like about just 7% of South Koreans would say they support like outright full-scale sort of economic decoupling with China. And just like 20% would support South Korean direct involvement in US military operations to defend Taiwan against China. So, this is just a reality of South Korea. And I think something the alliance managers in the Washington just have to keep in mind, like remarks by Lee Jae-myung, questioning why South Korea should meddle with the Taiwan issue a few months ago. I think it raised the eyebrows of many in Washington, but that's gonna resonate with a lot of South Koreans who are just like very worried about, they're already so worried about, the growing North Korean nuclear threat. And in addition to that, now having to sort of share the burden of defending Taiwan and sort of fighting a new Cold War with China, that's huge security burdens, And when the security risks and burdens of the alliance sort of are perceived to outweigh those of autonomy, more South Koreans could start thinking that, questioning the value of maintaining the alliance, So I think it's just something that we really need to keep in mind, just like, how the US might be sort of self-sabotaging in the way that, in the sense that, we're adding more and more security burdens to the alliance. And so, yeah.
Great, thank you. I think that's a helpful warning for people in DC to be careful how far they push and in what way they do it. There's a handful of questions here. They all kind of have to do with ideological or cultural developments within South Korean politics. So I'm gonna read all of these off, and any of you are free to respond to any of them. I think they're all very interesting. The first questioner, Frederick McNulty, asks about far right-wing YouTubers and to what extent they've influenced Yoon Suk-yeol, but then also contrast that with some outreach that Yoon has done on the Gwangju massacre, which seems to stand in tension with the sort of right-wing perspective. So that's the first one. Second one, Elizabeth Tuckwell asks about the 4B Women's Rebellion. This is a movement in Korea forswearing romantic, sexual, and familial relationships with men amongst women. Is this an important factor in Korean politics at all? And the last question, Riley Robinson asks about the activist, religious, and spiritual leaders like Ham Seok-yeon. Are they still a presence in Korean politics? Anyone have any thoughts on any of it?
Let me take a quick crack at it, because I think a couple of the questions really raise a real important point that we haven't touched upon yet, which is this investigation is really showing that much of Yoon's motivation in this self-coup was fueled by this right-wing YouTube brain rot. There's no kind way of describing this, because there is this right-wing YouTube YouTube ecosystem that churns out conspiracy theories about election fraud, to a point where Yoon apparently himself questioned that, well, shouldn't I have won by 15% rather than 0.7%? Clearly, this is an election fraud. And the one of the Yoon only had a handful of support from the military. Most of the military wasn't aware of his plan, so he didn't have a whole ton to go by. But the only two streams of military forces that he deployed was one to the National Assembly to stop and try and arrest the lawmakers, and the other is to the Election Commission to discover evidence of election rigging. And that really is a terrible sign for the world, I must say. I keep seeing parallels between US and Korean politics, and here's another situation where this YouTube stuff is really fueling an alternate reality and making people behave in very dangerous ways.
Thanks, Nathan. Natalia, do you want to take a shot?
Yeah, sure. Regarding the 4B movement, I think this is part of a systemic issue we're seeing globally, it's not unique to South Korea. Back to Yoon's campaign that I mentioned was very tumultuous, very contentious. He ran a campaign that was very directed at young, frustrated Korean men who were denying systemic gender inequality, denying men being at fault for anything related to the low fertility rate and the low birth rate that we're seeing in South Korea. So it's very all interconnected. I wouldn't say that the 4B movement plays a significant role in Korean politics, but it's part of a symptom of the systemic issues we're seeing that contribute to this systemic gender inequality and a lot of the frustrations we're seeing. And, South Korea recently just had a big issue with private chat rooms through Telegram contributing to deepfake porn of people as young as middle schoolers. So we're seeing a lot of systemic issues, as I said, related to gender inequality. And I think that it's easy for smaller, more vocal groups on either side to kind of cling to that and to start blaming other people. So when you see a politician that's taking strong stances, it's a lot easier to cling to that. But then you also see more vocal, extreme reactions like the 4B movement to Yoon's policies.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful. And it's a good reminder that these sort of like big foreign policy issues actually are deeply, intimately connected to structural issues around gender, around nativism, the question of the foreign presence in however that's defined in our societies, the issue of populism, anti-elite politics. We're seeing these as features of politics around the world, and they have real implications on foreign policy. So I think this is a good reminder for the foreign policy community to take seriously how these things connect and what kinds of dangers they pose, and maybe also what kinds of opportunities they pose. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. We've come to the end of the hour. I want to thank all of my panelists, Nathan Park, Natalia Slavny, and James Park. This was, I think, a really helpful and rich discussion. And on behalf of the Quincy Institute, I believe this will be our final event for the year, barring some sort of terrible crisis that forces us to get active again. So let's keep fingers crossed that this is our final event of the year. I want to wish everyone happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year. We actually have one event lined up already for January 7th, talking about the science and technology agreement that the US and China quite belatedly concluded the other day. So looking forward to that, and looking forward to seeing all of you in the new year. Thank you all.